I remember the first moment I felt truly invisible in my own family. It was a crisp autumn morning in Greenock, our small town, when my parents announced a surprise weekend trip for my older siblings, Jonah and Felicity, to a lakeside resort. I was 9 years old, and they casually mentioned I would stay behind with Grandma due to budget constraints. Even then, I sensed something deeper at play. Grandma tried to make it fun, offering sugar cookies and endless cartoons, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was excluded on purpose. That dynamic followed me throughout childhood. My parents, Harriet and Leonard, were quick to celebrate Jonah's every guitar riff or Felicity's latest painting. Meanwhile, I, Nadia, rarely received more than a nod, even when I excelled in school. I kept hoping that by working hard and keeping my head down, I'd eventually earn the same affection. Yet my efforts were met with indifference. By 15, I was drafted into helping at my parents' bakery. Jonah and Felicity received generous allowances for their tasks, but I was told it was my duty to work for free. Whether I scrubbed pans or hauled 50-pound flour sacks, nobody seemed to notice my exhaustion. I tried not to complain, trusting my dedication would gain their respect. In reality, they praised my siblings for the smallest effort, while mine went unmentioned. As my 18th birthday approached, the tension at home rose. The bakery had turned enough profit for my parents to open a second location, funded by a second mortgage. Jonah was set for a lavish graduation party. Felicity was busy showcasing her art in local galleries, and I simply wanted help applying for college. When I asked my parents to co-sign a student loan, they refused, labeling it, the risk. That rejection hurt more than all their past slights combined. My grandmother noticed how withdrawn I'd become and intervened. Despite living on a tight pension, she offered her spare bedroom and even pitched in for my application fees. Leaving felt like betrayal, but staying had become unbearable. One frosty morning, a week before my birthday, I packed my belongings and slipped out the door. Grandma's modest cottage felt like a place of healing. She saw my frustration and encouraged me to channel it into something positive. Soon I discovered an unexpected knack for making jewelry out of thrifted items, turning old cake toppers into quirky pendants. Grandma suggested I open a tiny online shop. Initially, I sold only a handful of pieces, barely enough to cover groceries. Then word spread, and before long, orders began piling up. For the first time, I felt both valued and independent, an unfamiliar but thrilling sensation. Back in Greenock, the second bakery wasn't performing as well as my parents had hoped. Jonah's guitar lessons and Felicity's expensive art materials devoured resources. Late payments on the second mortgage began stacking up, and whispers circulated that my parents were at risk of losing their house. Sometimes I'd lie awake, recalling nights I prayed for just a hint of their approval. Now I watched the situation reverse, leaving me conflicted about how to respond. Then one evening, my phone buzzed. It was my mother, her voice quivering. She explained their mounting debts, overdue bills, medical expenses, and unforeseen business losses. She brought up my success and urged me to do the right thing by helping them keep the house. That phrase replayed in my mind, fueling a storm of conflicting emotions. On one hand, they raised me, however imperfectly. On the other, I couldn't ignore the years of neglect. My birthdays forgotten, my achievements downplayed, my labor taken for granted. Should I bail them out now that I'd finally found my own footing? Or was it time they faced the consequences of choices they'd made without me in mind? I spent long nights tossing and turning, torn between guilt and resentment. Childhood memories flooded back. My father's proud grin whenever Jonah aced a test, his shrug when I did even better. The standing ovation Felicity received at her art show while I cheered from the sidelines, my own efforts left uncelebrated. Was I heartless if I refused? Or was it simply fair to let them reap what they'd sown? That's where this story truly begins, on the brink of an impossible decision. I'm unpacking the years of favoritism and frustration that shaped me, the journey that led me to Grandma's supportive haven, and the unexpected entrepreneurial spark that boosted my confidence. Now, with the roles reversed, I face a question that goes beyond money. Do I stay the dutiful child who rescues them, or do I finally stand up for myself? I expected I'd someday hold their fate in my hands. I hung up that night feeling torn, angry yet pitying my parents. Hearing them so vulnerable was surreal. Mounting debts, overdue mortgage payments, fear of losing everything. My mother's plea to do the right thing echoed in my head. But what was right? I lay awake for hours, reliving every childhood slight and feeling my chest tighten at the thought of bailing them out. Jonah was always the star, his guitar chords echoing through our home, while I swept up confetti after family gatherings. Felicity's art adorned the bakery walls, celebrated as inspired genius. Meanwhile, I was the afterthought, relegated to endless chores. Now my parents needed the very child they'd once overlooked. A twisted sense of satisfaction mingled with guilt, leaving me more unsettled than ever. Over the following days, I dodged their calls. Grandma noticed my turmoil and quietly offered her wisdom. "You owe them nothing," she told me, sipping her tea. "But sometimes helping others is about finding your own peace." Her words stuck with me, and I wondered if peace was even possible without confronting the anger simmering in my soul. Eventually, I mustered the resolve to visit the bakery. The sweet smell of cinnamon and dough triggered memories of simpler times. Jonah stood behind the counter, scrolling through his phone. He looked startled when I walked in. We exchanged awkward greetings, and he mentioned our parents were at the bank, hoping for an extension on their loan. A tense undercurrent lingered between us, a reminder of how distant we'd become. Before we could delve deeper, Felicity stepped in with a large canvas. She managed a subdued smile, her usual brilliance replaced by visible strain. It was startling to see her so deflated. We stood in apprehensive silence until our parents appeared, their eyes hollow with worry. They ushered us into a cramped office. At the back, paperwork cluttered the desk, bank statements, overdue notices, pages filled with desperate calculations. My mother's eyes brimmed with tears. My father looked decades older than before. They spoke in frantic tones, begging me to lend them enough money to cover their debts. My mother leaned on the idea of good children, while my father tried to promise repayment with interest. Compassion clashed with my lingering resentment. As they explained their situation, I recalled lonely birthdays and brushed off accomplishments, moments when I longed for even a sliver of acknowledgement. Now, their desperation echoed the pleas I'd once directed at them for understanding or support. My head swirled. Would helping them finally heal my old wounds, or deepen them by re-establishing an unfair dynamic? I pressed for details and learned that the second bakery was floundering. Jonah and Felicity contributed little to household bills, and my father's surgery had piled on medical costs. The gravity of it all was clear, yet memories of their indifference festered. Part of me wanted to walk away. Another part felt I'd never forgive myself if they lost their home. My mother insisted they never intended to neglect me, that they loved me in their own way. The words sounded hollow, but the remorse in her eyes looked genuine. Jonah and Felicity loitered nearby, keenly aware that my decision might determine their future. Grandma's voice echoed in my mind. Sometimes you help for your own peace, not for the other person's redemption. Unable to decide, I told them I needed time. Stepping out, I inhaled the crisp air. My heart pounded as though I'd run a marathon, but I'd only crossed the bakery's threshold. Jonah mumbled something like an apology. Felicity lowered her gaze, and my parents stood there, a tableau of desperation. I realized I was no longer a powerless child. I drove back to Grandma's, head spinning with conflicting emotions. She welcomed me with a gentle hug, and I spilled every detail of our conversation. Her gaze was calm as she asked me one question. "Is your goal to settle old debts, or to shape the life you want?" That thought haunted me all night. If I saved them, would it validate the child I once was, or lock me into an ongoing cycle of obligation? If I refused, would I bear the guilt of watching them lose everything? Morning found me no closer to a solution. Yet I understood the power dynamic had altered forever. I wasn't the overlooked daughter quietly wishing for their approval anymore. My choice would redefine both our family bonds and my own sense of identity. Their pleas echoed in my mind, but so did memories of all those times I was left behind. For the first time, I saw a path leading away from bitterness, or deeper into it. I still had no concrete answer. I spent the next few days in a haze, unable to focus on my work or anything else. Every order I packaged for my online shop reminded me that I could afford to help my parents, yet every memory of their dismissals nudged me to let them face the consequences of their choices. Sleep became elusive. I'd drift off, only to jolt awake from dreams where the bakery shutters closed for good, and my parents were on the street, blaming me for their downfall. In search of clarity, I decided to meet with a financial advisor. If I were to lend my parents a large sum, I wanted to be sure it wouldn't jeopardize my own stability. Grandma offered to join me, but I asked her to stay home. This was a decision I needed to handle on my own, however painful. When I explained the situation to the advisor, Mr. Caldwell, a kindly man with silver-framed glasses, he raised an eyebrow and asked me whether I'd considered the emotional cost. He talked about family loans often leading to broken relationships when repayment became murky. I left his office with a pounding heart, still nowhere near a resolution. That afternoon I went for a drive, heading out beyond Greenwich's limits. Rain pelted my windshield, matching the turmoil churning inside me. My mind drifted back to childhood days when I'd watch Jonah open pricey birthday gifts or see Felicity's new paint set, while my requests for a second-hand bicycle fell on deaf ears. Yet I also recalled fleeting moments of warmth, like the time my father taught me how to tie my shoelaces, or the night my mother braided my hair before a school recital. Those memories were few, but they existed. Eventually, I pulled into a gravel lot near an abandoned barn, a spot I used to visit with Grandma to pick wildflowers when I was little. The fields were drenched now, not a single blossom in sight. I sat there, engine running, phone clutched in my hand. A new message from Jonah appeared. Need to talk, something important. My stomach twisted. Since when did Jonah need to confide in me? Curiosity and concern got the better of me, so I agreed to meet him at a local diner that evening. The Cozy Plate had been around for decades, a nostalgic place serving greasy fries and milkshakes. I arrived first and took a booth in the far corner, hoping for privacy. Jonah showed up late, water dripping from his hair as he wrestled out of a soaked jacket. He settled across from me, avoiding my eyes. "How are you?" he asked softly, and I almost laughed. It was an absurd question, given the circumstances, but I appreciated his attempt at civility. After an awkward pause, he looked around to ensure no one was listening. Then he leaned forward, fingers tracing a crack in the linoleum tabletop. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, voice shaky. "Felicity and I found records in Dad's office, receipts, invoices, stuff that doesn't add up. We think there might be money going somewhere else, not just the bakery or medical bills." My pulse kicked up a notch. "Are you saying Dad's hiding something?" Jonah swallowed hard. "Maybe, we're not sure. Felicity noticed the dates on certain transactions didn't match any bakery expenses, and they were for amounts higher than normal supply orders. We confronted Mom, but she just told us not to worry. When we asked Dad, he said it was business stuff, but we're scared it's worse than that." I struggled to process this new layer. My parents had always been careless with finances, but I'd never suspected an outright secret funneling of money. Was it gambling? Or some ill-advised investment? My thoughts raced, chasing every grim possibility. "So why tell me?" I asked at last. Jonah sighed. "Because if you're thinking of giving them money, you should know there might be a hole you can't fill. Felicity and I, we feel guilty. We never questioned where the funds came from for our lessons and supplies. We just assumed everything was fine. Now it seems like Mom and Dad were borrowing from one source to pay another." I leaned back, the diner's neon lights buzzing overhead. This revelation added a new dimension to my dilemma. Not only were my parents in debt, but they could be hiding something that might swallow any help I offered. It was a betrayal layered atop the lingering pains of my childhood. Jonah's voice wavered. "I know I haven't been the best brother. Felicity either. But I don't want to see them dragged down by whatever this is. I also don't want to drag you down with them." We ordered coffees, sipping them in grim silence. My mind reeled, re-examining every sign I'd ignored. The hush when finances came up, the random times Dad disappeared during the day, the tension etched into Mom's face. Now it made sense. My parents might be drowning in more than just overdue mortgages, and they'd asked me, of all people, to toss them a lifeline, maybe without a bottom. I left the diner that night unsure if I felt relief or deeper anguish. Part of me was almost grateful for an excuse to hold back, yet another part was furious at the deception. As I drove home, headlights piercing the darkness, I realized the stakes were higher than I'd imagined. My parents' desperation wasn't just about paying off legitimate debts. It could be about covering up something far more destructive. And if I stepped in blindly, I might get pulled under too. Jonah's revelation about Dad's suspicious finances left me sleepless. My lingering resentment at their years of favoritism clashed with a gnawing worry. What if they were in worse trouble than I'd ever guessed? The morning after Jonah called, I decided I had to see the evidence for myself. He arranged a time for us to search Dad's office while our parents were out at yet another bank meeting, presumably begging for an extension to dodge foreclosure. Stepping into the house felt surreal. The creak of the floorboards and the faint smell of flour pulled me back to teenage nights spent doing chores no one acknowledged. Jonah guided me down the hall to Dad's cramped office. Felicity stood amid haphazard stacks of folders, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. She gestured toward a cluster of invoices. "These companies don't ring any bells," she said, her voice shaking. One folder bore the name Rockton Supply. "You're in multiple places. Another contained monthly payments addressed to a P.O. box in Marshfield. The amounts were large and unaccounted for in any bakery ledger. An uneasy chill swept over me. Dad had insisted he just needed help covering the mortgage on our struggling bakery, but these invoices suggested a deeper story, maybe even deception. Jonah shook his head grimly. He said everything was for the bakery's second location, but look at these codes. None match our equipment suppliers. The sting of betrayal flared inside me. Had they always been this secretive? A notification buzzed on Jonah's phone. "They're on their way home," he hissed. We had only minutes to spare. Felicity and I hastily snapped pictures with our phones, capturing every suspicious line item. My pulse hammered as we shoved folders back, praying we'd left no trace of our snooping. Mom and Dad entered soon after, looking haggard and worn. Mom's eyes flicked between the three of us. I could see a flicker of unease when she noticed Felicity clutching her phone a bit too tightly. Dad tried to rally a smile and suggested we get takeout to discuss financial options, but anxiety roiled in my gut. I muttered an excuse and slipped out the door, ignoring the uncertain looks they cast my way. That evening, I pored over the photos, each cryptic entry fueling my suspicions. The term consulting fees surfaced repeatedly, yet it was unclear who was consulting or why. Addresses led nowhere or to vague business names. If I loaned them money now, would I be pouring cash into a black hole of mismanagement or worse? Grandma noticed my agitation over dinner. When I offered a few cautious details, she shook her head. "People do desperate things when they feel cornered," she said, her voice gentle. "But you have to protect yourself." Jonah and Felicity bombarded me with texts all night, each message dripping with the same fear and confusion I felt. We rarely agreed on much growing up, but now we shared the same dread. Uncovering the truth might break what remained of our family, yet ignoring it felt irresponsible and naive. I thought about confronting Mom and Dad, demanding they explain every invoice. But what if they denied it all or deflected blame onto each other? The memory of them begging me for help, tears shining in my mother's eyes, clashed with the possibility that they'd lured me into a financial sinkhole. I felt a small stab of guilt, recalling the times they'd shown me kindness. Had those moments been genuine? Or had I just been convenient whenever Jonah and Felicity were busy? Late into the night, I studied the numbers again, trying to find a legitimate explanation for the mysterious outflow. None emerged. Exhausted, I pressed my palms to my eyes, recalling lonely birthdays and unfulfilled promises. And the heartbreak of my childhood was transforming into something larger, overshadowed by the suspicion that my parents were deceiving all three of us now. By morning, I'd accepted that there was no easy fix. Even if they were innocent of any grave wrongdoing, they were hiding something significant. If I simply handed over the money, I might enable a secret that could ruin them and me in the long run. If I refused, I'd be turning my back on a family that was finally asking for my help, even if that help might be rooted in manipulation. Felicity called again at midday, her voice taut. "We can't just let this slide," she said, panic lacing every word. "But I'm terrified of what will happen if we push too hard. Do you think they'll admit it?" I had no ready answer. Jonah texted soon after, echoing her anxiety. It was surreal to be at the center of a crisis that none of us knew how to solve. In the end, I realized the illusions keeping our family afloat had cracked beyond repair. Their mortgage plea might have been only one thread in a much larger web. One way or another, the truth would soon surface, forcing me to choose whether I would confront them head-on or silently enable their secrets. My heart hammered at the thought of what might unfold, but I knew there was no going back. The fragile foundation we'd built our relationships on was about to be tested, and I braced myself for whatever came next. A restless night yielded no fresh perspective, and by daybreak I found myself pacing Grandma's small living room. She eyed me from her armchair, knitting needles clicking gently. Though she spoke few words, the weight of her concern pressed on me like a tangible force. Grandma had always been my refuge, the single adult figure I could rely on when the rest of the family left me in the background. Jonah finally texted, "We can't keep ignoring it. Let's talk." A moment later, Felicity chimed in, echoing the same sentiment. My heart clenched at the thought of a confrontation, yet I knew it was inevitable. Secrets rarely remain hidden for long, and ours were already burning holes through the family dynamic. We arranged to meet at Grandma's house that afternoon, away from prying eyes at the bakery. They arrived together wearing solemn expressions. The moment they stepped inside, tension thickened the air. We settled around the kitchen table, the hum of the old refrigerator our only soundtrack. I offered them drinks, and Jonah declined with a terse shake of his head. Felicity fiddled with the corner of a placemat, her eyes darting nervously. "We can't pretend anymore," Jonah said. "We have to confront them. Either we get answers, or—" His voice trailed off, the unspoken threat of walking away from our parents altogether hanging in the air. Felicity nodded, chewing her lip. "I can't sleep. I keep thinking about those documents. If they've been lying about the mortgage, or about where the money's really going, I need to know why." She exhaled shakily. "Do they even realize how close they are to losing us? It's like they've turned us into pawns in some bigger scheme." My stomach churned. I'd spent years feeling overlooked, but in this twisted scenario, my parents' attention felt even worse. They wanted my money, my support, without offering a shred of honesty. Yet a part of me still grasped at the hope that maybe, just maybe, there was a rational explanation. "Okay," I said, forcing steadiness into my voice. "We call them and ask them to come here. We sit them down and show them what we found, and we don't back down until they tell us the truth." Jonah inhaled sharply. "It won't be easy. Dad can get defensive. Mom might cry." "I know," I said, "but we can't let that stop us." The plan was set. The three of us huddled over Felicity's phone as she dialed. Mom picked up, sounding tired and wary. Felicity kept her request short. "Come to Grandma's house now, without excuses. We have to talk, all of us." After a tense pause, Mom agreed, saying they'd be there soon. Time seemed to crawl in the interim. Grandma sat in the living room, pointedly ignoring our hush-hush conversation, but clearly attuned to our apprehension. She made tea and placed extra cups on the table. "I'll be in my room if you need me," she murmured, the lines on her face deep with concern. We heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Jonah went to the door, posture stiff as a soldier. Mom and Dad entered quietly, their eyes flicking between the three of us. They must have sensed the gravity of the situation. Neither offered forced pleasantries. Once we were all seated around the table, silence enveloped us. I cleared my throat. "We've found documents," I began carefully, glancing at Jonah and Felicity for support. "Invoices and payments that don't match the bakery's expenses. We know you've been asking for money to save the mortgage, but there's more to it, isn't there?" Dad's jaw tightened, and he folded his arms across his chest. Mom's eyes filled with tears almost instantly. "Why would you go snooping?" she murmured, voice trembling. "Because we're scared," Felicity said, her words more forceful than I'd ever heard. "You asked for help. You said we'd lose our house. Then we find out about these mystery businesses and random addresses. Tell us the truth." Jonah placed a copy of one invoice on the table. "This is a monthly payment to Rockton Supply, Inc. What is that company? Why is it costing so much?" Dad snatched the paper, refusing to meet our eyes. Mom reached for his arm, trying to still his shaking hand. It's complicated," she began. But Jonah shook his head, cutting her off. "Not good enough," he said. "We deserve an explanation, or we walk. You can't keep us in the dark while expecting us to bail you out." Mom's tears spilled over. She trembled, glancing at Dad. After a long, agonizing pause, he finally spoke, voice low. "We borrowed money from a private lender, and the terms weren't good. Rockton Supply is just a front for them. They charge massive fees every month, and if we can't pay, they threaten us." A chill ran down my spine. Loan sharks, high-risk loans, hidden under false expenses. "Why not just tell us?" I demanded. "We're your kids. If you needed help, why hide it behind a fake company?" Dad's gaze flicked to Jonah and Felicity. "You both rely on us. The bakery, your guitar lessons, your art supplies. We were trying to cover everything. Then I got injured, and the medical bills piled up. It spiraled out of control. And you thought you could keep borrowing indefinitely?" Felicity's voice shook. "You could have asked for honest help instead of hiding behind shady loans." Mom rubbed her temples, tears leaking down her cheeks. "We were ashamed. We thought we could fix it before any of you found out. We never meant to drag you into this mess." Pity and anger swirled inside me. Jonah stared at the invoice, fists clenched. "So now what?" he asked, voice taut. "You want Nadia's money to pay off these sharks? Do you realize how risky that is?" Dad swallowed hard. "We don't have many options left. If we don't settle with them soon, they could force us out of the bakery and take the house." All eyes turned to me. The once invisible child had become their best hope. Grandma hovered by the door, sorrow etched into her features. My head throbbed with the weight of the decision. "This is huge," I managed. "I need time to think. We all do." Dad nodded, shame scrawled across his face. Mom buried hers in her hands. Felicity and Jonah looked at me, torn between empathy and outrage. Never had the line between saving them and saving myself felt so thin. We weren't just deciding on a loan. We were deciding if our broken trust could ever be mended. I spent the next day in a fog, torn between the mounting guilt of abandoning my parents and the nagging intuition that bailing them out might only dig us all deeper. Every time my phone buzzed, I half expected it to be Jonah or Felicity, demanding that I make a decision. But no messages came. A tense silence had settled over us, as if we all needed time to absorb the full impact of Dad's confession about the loan sharks. Grandma watched me pace her living room. She didn't push, but I could feel her sympathy radiating in every glance. Finally, she set down her knitting and spoke softly. "You have a good heart, Nadia, but sometimes good hearts have to draw boundaries. If you do help them, make sure you're not enabling a cycle." Her words echoed in my head as I tried to imagine the consequences of either choice. If I refused, my parents could lose the bakery, maybe even the house. Could I carry that knowledge, knowing I had the means to help but chose not to? Yet if I gave them my money, I might be throwing it into a pit of deceit. The swirling questions kept me awake that night, staring at the ceiling with a growing sense of dread. Morning brought an unexpected call. Mom's voice trembled on the line. "I know you need time, but the lender's pushing up the deadline. They want a payment in 3 days, or they'll start seizing assets." Her anxiety was palpable. "We can't hold them off any longer." My stomach lurched. 3 days, that was all the time I had to decide. "I'll figure something out," I managed, hanging up with a shaky breath. The clock was ticking. Shortly after, Felicity and Jonah arrived at Grandma's without warning. They looked as restless as I felt. "We can't stay quiet," Felicity said. Her eyes rimmed red. "Mom called me crying, saying Dad's meeting with them soon." Jonah rubbed his temples. "It's messed up. They're in too deep. But they're still our parents." He glanced at me, guilt flickering in his gaze. "We never realized how bad things were because they always kept us shielded." The three of us debated our limited options. Felicity proposed an idea. "If I were to provide some money, maybe we could negotiate more favorable terms." Jonah suggested involving a lawyer, someone who understood shady lending practices and could mediate. I wondered if the loan sharks would even listen to reason. Desperation rarely breeds fairness. Eventually, we agreed on a plan. We'd confront the lender with our parents, making it clear that we intended to repay a portion, on the condition that the remaining fees be dropped or reduced. We hoped they'd accept something rather than risk legal exposure. It was a flimsy plan, but it was the best we had. I called Mom back, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. "I'll help," I told her, voice trembling, "but only if you and Dad let us come with you to negotiate." She hesitated, then agreed. Relief, fear, and shame mingled in her tone. Part of me was furious they'd let it come to this. Another part was terrified I was stepping into a trap of my own making. The next day, we caravanned to a dingy strip mall on the outskirts of a neighboring town, a place neither cozy nor safe. The so-called office sat between a shuttered pawn shop and a payday loan storefront. My palms were slick with sweat as we entered. A tall man in a worn suit eyed us from behind a battered desk. Dad introduced him as Mr. Glenn, though I suspected that might not be his real name. We arranged ourselves on rickety chairs. The air felt stale, tension crackling. Mom kept her gaze fixed on the floor while Dad tried to project an air of confidence. Jonah and Felicity hovered behind me. I clutched a folder containing evidence of our parents' predicament, trying to radiate authority I didn't fully feel. Mr. Glenn's voice was as rough as the peeling paint on the walls. "I don't usually do meetings with extended family," he said, leaning back. "But since you're here, what's your offer?" Before Dad could respond, I cleared my throat. "We know the fees have ballooned beyond what's fair or even legal. We're prepared to repay the principal and a reasonable interest, but the extra charges have to be dropped." He gave a low chuckle. "Fair? Legal?" He flicked through a stack of papers. "Your parents signed. They knew the terms." Felicity squared her shoulders. "They were desperate. You preyed on that." Her voice shook, but her words were resolute. Mr. Glenn tapped a pen against the table, eyeing me. "So you're the one with the money? Let's be clear. You pay, or this gets nasty." "Simple enough." I fought back a surge of anger. "We're not here to argue all day. We can pay what's owed on the principal plus legitimate interest on a set schedule. You drop the penalties or we walk." A nerve twitched in Mr. Glenn's. "Juyo?" Silence stretched. Finally, he shrugged. "Fine, but I'll need a lump sum right now and a written guarantee for the rest. You miss a payment and all bets are off." His eyes flicked to Dad. "And I'll make sure you regret it." My heart thundered. I'd half expected a refusal, yet the acceptance felt as intimidating as any threat. We hashed out the rough terms. I'd pay a large chunk immediately, enough to settle the most aggressive fees, then smaller monthly installments for whatever remained of the principal and interest. The sense of walking into quicksand gripped me, yet I saw no alternative if I wanted to salvage any part of the family's future. When it was done, Mr. Glenn wrote an address where we'd transfer funds. He smirked. "You keep your schedule, we stay civil. Slip up and I come knocking." On the drive home, my emotions whirled. Mom and Dad were subdued in the car ahead, their relief overshadowed by the grim reality of what we'd just done. Felicity rode with me, hunched in the passenger seat, tears silently rolling down her cheeks. Jonah trailed behind in his own vehicle, no doubt grappling with the same storm of anger, fear, and guilt. That evening we gathered at Grandma's table again, worn out, both physically and emotionally. Dad tried to muster thanks, but the words felt hollow. We all knew this was just the beginning of a rigid repayment schedule, not an instant fix. Mom's face was streaked with tears, a mixture of gratitude and shame. I stared at them, remembering the years of neglect and favoritism. My resentment flared, but so did a stubborn sense of kinship. Like it or not, these were my parents. By stepping in, I'd taken control in a way they never had for me. Would it be enough to mend the cracks between us? No one had answers that night. We sat in strained silence, sipping lukewarm tea as the weight of our agreement bore down. I'd set a boundary, demanded transparency, and secured a deal that might keep them afloat. Yet the trust between us was paper thin. As the clock ticked toward midnight, I realized this was the unexpected twist. In rescuing them, I'd altered our entire dynamic. I was no longer the overlooked child. But whether that shift would lead to reconciliation, or simply a new form of heartache, remained to be seen. The debt we owed, both financial and emotional, had only begun to be repaid. That's the end of today's story. Did things turn out the way you thought, or were there some surprises along the way? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to hit the like button. And if you haven't joined the community yet, now's the perfect time. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're always the first to catch new stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next adventure.